Christopher Houston. Kit Carson was an American frontiersman. The few paying jobs he had during his lifetime included mountain man, wilderness guide, Indian agent, and American Army officer. Carson became a frontier legend in his own lifetime via biographies and news articles. Exaggerated versions of his exploits were the subject of dime novels. Carson left home in rural present-day Missouri at age 16 to become a mountain man and trapper in the West. In the 1830s, he accompanied Ewing Young on an expedition to Mexican California and joined fur trapping expeditions into the Rocky Mountains. He lived among and married into the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes. In the 1840s, he was hired as a guide by John C. Fremont. Fremont's expedition covered much of California, Oregon, and the Great Basin area. Fremont mapped and wrote reports and commentaries on the Oregon Trail to assist and encourage westward-bound American pioneers. Carson achieved national fame through Fremont's accounts of his expeditions. Under Fremont's command, Carson participated in the uprising against Mexican rule in California at the beginning of the Mexican-American War. Later in the war, Carson was a scout and courier, celebrated for his rescue mission after the Battle of San Pasqual and for his coast-to-coast journey from California to Washington, D.C. to deliver news of the conflict in California to the U.S. government. In the 1850s, he was appointed as the Indian agent to the Ute Indians and the Jicarilla Apaches. During the American Civil War, Carson led a regiment of mostly Hispanic volunteers from New Mexico on the side of the Union at the Battle of Valverde in 1862. When the Confederate threat to New Mexico was eliminated, Carson led forces to suppress the Navajo, Mescalero Apache, and the Kiowa and Comanche Indians. Carson was brevetted a brigadier general, and took command of Fort Garland, Colorado. He was there only briefly. Poor health forced him to retire from military life. Carson was married 3 times and had 10 children. The Carson home was in Taos, New Mexico. Carson died at Fort Leon, Colorado, of an aortic aneurysm on May 23, 1868. He is buried in Taos, New Mexico, next to his third wife Josefa Jaramillo. Early life. Carson was born in Kentucky on Christmas Eve, 1809. His parents were Lindsey Carson and his second wife, Rebecca Robinson. Lindsey had had 5 children by his first wife, Lucy Bradley, and 10 more children by Rebecca. Kit was the 6th, making him the 11th of Lindsey's offspring. Lindsey Carson had a Scots-Irish Presbyterian background. He was a farmer, a cabin builder, and a veteran of the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. He fought Indians on the American frontier, losing 2 fingers on his left hand in a battle with the Fox and Sauk Indians. The Carson family moved to Boone's Lick, Howard County, Missouri when Kit was about 1 year old. The family settled on a tract of land owned by the sons of Daniel Boone, who had purchased the land from the Spanish. The Boone and Carson families became good friends, working and socializing together, and intermarrying. Lindsey's oldest son William married Boone's grandniece, Millie Boone, in 1810. The daughter Adeline became Kit's favorite playmate. Missouri was then the frontier of American expansionism west. Cabins were forted with tall stockade fences to defend against Indian attacks. As men worked in the fields, sentries were posted with weapons to protect the farmers. These men were ready to kill any Indian who attacked. Carson wrote in his memoirs, "For 2 or 3 years after our arrival, we had to remain forted, and it was necessary to have men stationed at the extremities of the fields for the protection of those that were laboring." In 1818, Lindsey Carson died instantly when a tree limb fell on him while clearing a field. Kit was about 8 years old. Despite being penniless, his mother took care of her children alone for 4 years. She then married Joseph Martin, a widower with several children. Kit was a young teenager at the time and did not get along with his stepfather. The decision was made to apprentice him to David Workman of Sadler in Franklin, Missouri. Kit wrote in his memoirs that Workman was a good man, and I often recall the kind treatment I received. Franklin was situated at the eastern end of the Santa Fe Trail, which had opened 2 years earlier. Many of the customers at the saddle shop were trappers and traders, from whom Carson heard stirring tales of the West. Carson found work in the saddlery not to his taste. He once stated, "The business did not suit me, and I concluded to leave." Santa Fe Trail. In August 1826, against his mother's wishes, Kit ran away from his apprenticeship. He went west with a caravan of fur trappers, tending the livestock. They made the trek over the Santa Fe Trail to Santa Fe, the capital of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, reaching the destination in November 1826. Kit settled in Taos. Carson lived with Matthew Conkey, a trapper and explorer who had served with Carson's older brothers during the War of 1812. Carson was mentored by Conkey in learning the skills of a trapper, while learning the necessary languages for trade. Eventually he became fluent in Spanish and several Indian languages. Workman put an advertisement in a local newspaper back in Missouri. He wrote that he would give a 1-cent reward to anyone who brought the boy back to Franklin. No one claimed the reward. It was a bit of a joke, but Carson was free. The advertisement featured the first printed description of Carson. Christopher Carson, a boy about 16 years old, small of his age but thick-set, light hair, ran away from the subscriber, living in Franklin, Howard County, Missouri, to whom he had been bound to learn the saddler's trade. Between 1827 and 1829, Carson worked as cook, translator, and wagon driver in the Southwest. He also worked at a copper mine near the Gila River in southwestern New Mexico. In later life, Carson never mentioned any women from his youth. There are only 3 specific women mentioned in his writing: Josefa Jaramillo, his third and last wife, a comrade's mother in Washington, D.C., and Mrs. Ann White, a victim of Indian atrocities. Mountain man. At the age of 19, Carson began his career as a mountain man. He traveled through many parts of the American West with famous mountain men like Jim Bridger and Old Bill Williams. He spent the winter of 1828 to 1829 as a cook for Ewing Young in Taos. He joined Young's trapping expedition of 1829. The leadership of Young and the experience of the venture are credited with shaping Carson's early life in the mountains. During August 1829, the party went into Apache country along the Gila River. The expedition was attacked, being Carson's first experience of combat. Young's party continued on into Alta California, trapping and trading in California from Sacramento in the north to Los Angeles in the south, returning to Taos, New Mexico in April 1830 after trapping along the Colorado River. Carson joined a wagon train rescue party after entering Taos, and although the perpetrators had fled the scene of atrocities, Young had the opportunity to witness Carson's horsemanship and courage. Carson joined another expedition led by Thomas Fitzpatrick and William Levin in 1831. Fitzpatrick, Levin and his trappers went north to the Central Rocky Mountains. Carson would hunt and trap in the West for about 10 years. He was known as a reliable man and a good fighter. Life for Carson as a mountain man was not easy. After collecting beavers from traps, he had to hold on to them for months at a time until the annual Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, held in remote areas of the West like the banks of the Green River in Wyoming, With the money received for the pelts, necessities of an independent life including fish hooks, flour and tobacco were procured. As there was little to no medical access in the varied regions he worked in, Carson had to dress his wounds and nurse himself. Conflict with particular Indians sometimes occurred. Carson's primary clothing at the time was in deer skins that had stiffened after being left outdoors for a time. This suit offered some protection against particular weapons employed by Indians. Grizzly bears were one of the mountain man's greatest enemies. A particular incident involving the animals happened to Carson in 1834 as he was hunting an elk alone. Two bears crossed paths with him and quickly chased him up a tree. One of the bears tried to make him fall by shaking the tree, but was not successful and eventually went away. Carson returned to his camp as fast as he could. He wrote in his memoirs that, "Finally concluded to leave, of which I was heartily pleased, never having been so scared in my life." The last rendezvous was held in 1840. At that time, the fur trade began to drop off. Fashionable men in London, Paris, and New York wanted silk hats instead of beaver hats. In addition, beaver populations across North America were declining rapidly from overexploitation. Carson knew it was time to find other work. He wrote in his memoirs that beaver was getting scarce. It became necessary to try our hand at something else. In 1841, he was hired at Bent's Fort in Colorado. This fort was one of the greatest buildings in the West. Hundreds of people worked to live there. Carson hunted buffalo, antelope, deer, and other animals to feed these people. He was paid $1 a day. He returned to Bent's Fort several times during his life to again provide meat for the fort's residents. Indian fighter. Carson was 19 when he set off with Ewing Young's expedition to the Rocky Mountains in 1829. In addition to furs and the company of free-spirited, rugged mountain men, Carson sought action and adventure. He found what he was looking for in killing and scalping Indians. Carson probably killed and took the scalp of his first Indian when he was 19 years old, during Ewing Young's expedition. Carson's memoirs are replete with stories about hostile Indian encounters with the memoirist. In January 1833, for example, warriors of the Crow tribe stole 9 horses from Carson's camp. Carson and 2 other men sprayed the Crow camp with gunfire, killing almost every Crow. Carson wrote in his memoirs, "During our pursuit for the lost animals, we suffered considerably, but the success of having recovered our horses and sending many a redskin to his long home, our sufferings were soon forgotten." Carson viewed the Blackfoot Nation as a hostile tribe, believing they posed the greatest threat to his livelihood, safety, and life. He hated the Blackfeet, and killed them at every opportunity. Historian David Roberts has written, "It was taken for granted that the Blackfeet were bad Indians. To shoot them whenever he could was a mountain man's instinct and duty." Carson had several encounters with the Blackfeet. His last battle with the Blackfeet took place in spring 1838. He was traveling with about 100 mountain men led by Jim Bridger. In Montana Territory, the group found a teepee with 3 Indian corpses inside. These 3 had died of smallpox. Bridger wanted to move on, but Carson and the other young men wanted to kill the Blackfeet. They found the Blackfoot village, and killed 10 Blackfeet warriors. The Blackfeet found some safety in a pile of rocks, but were driven away. It is not known how many Blackfeet died in this incident. Historian David Roberts writes, "If anything like pity filled Carson's breast as, in his 29th year, he beheld the ravaged camp of the Blackfeet, he did not bother to remember it." Carson wrote in his memoirs that this battle was the prettiest fight I ever saw. Carson's notions about Indians softened over the years. He found himself more and more in their company as he grew older. His notions about Indians became more understanding and more humane. He urged the government to set aside lands called reservations for their use. As an Indian agent, he saw to it that those under his watch were treated with honesty, fairness, and clothed and fed properly. Historian David Roberts believes his first marriage to an Arapaho woman named Singing Grass softened the stern and pragmatic mountaineers. Opportunism Expeditions with John Charles Fremont. In April 1842, Carson went back to his childhood home in Missouri to put his daughter Adeline in the care of relatives. On the return trip, Carson met John C. Fremont aboard a steamboat on the Missouri River. Fremont was a United States Army officer in the Corps of Topographical Engineers. He was about to lead an expedition into the West. After a brief conversation, Fremont hired Carson as a guide at $100 a month. It was the best-paying job of Carson's life. Fremont wrote, "I was pleased with him and his manner of address at this first meeting. He was a man of medium height, broad-shouldered, and deep-chested, with a clear, steady blue eye and frank speech and address, quiet and unassuming." In 1842, Carson guided Fremont across the Oregon Trail to South Pass, Wyoming. This was the first expedition into the West together. The purpose of this expedition was to map and describe the Oregon Trail as far as South Pass. A guidebook, maps, and other paraphernalia would be printed for westward-bound migrants and settlers. After the 5-month trouble-free mission was accomplished, Fremont wrote his government reports. These reports made Carson's name known across the United States, and spurred a migration of settlers westward to Oregon via the Oregon Trail. In 1843, Fremont asked Carson to join his second expedition. Carson did. He guided Fremont across part of the Oregon Trail to the Columbia River in Oregon. The purpose of the expedition was to map and describe the Oregon Trail from South Pass, Wyoming to the Columbia River. They also side-tripped to Great Salt Lake in Utah, using rubber rafts to navigate the waters. On the way to California, the party suffered from bad weather in the Sierra Nevada mountains, but were saved by Carson's good judgment and his skills as a guide. They found American settlers who fed them. The expedition then headed to California. This was illegal and dangerous because California was Mexican territory. The Mexican government ordered Fremont to leave. Fremont finally went back to Washington, D.C. The government liked his reports, but ignored his illegal trip into Mexico. Fremont was made a captain. The newspapers nicknamed him the Pathfinder. During this expedition, Fremont trekked into the Mojave Desert. His party met a Mexican man and boy. The two told Carson that Native Americans had ambushed the party of travelers. The male travelers were killed, the women travelers were staked to the ground, sexually mutilated, and killed. The murderers then stole the Mexicans' 30 horses. Carson and a mountain man friend named Alexis Gotti went after the murderers. They took 2 days to find them. They rushed into the camp, killing and scalping 2 of the murderers. The stolen horses were recovered and returned to the Mexican man and boy. This selfless, disinterested, generous deed brought Carson even greater fame. It confirmed his status as a Western hero in the eyes of the American people. Third Expedition, 1845. In 1845, Carson guided Fremont on the third and last expedition. They went to California and Oregon. Fremont made scientific plans, but the expedition appeared to be political in nature. Fremont may have been working under secret government orders. President Polk wanted the province of Alta California for the United States. Once in California, Fremont started to rouse the American settlers into a patriotic fever. The Mexican government ordered him to leave. Fremont went north to Oregon. He camped near Klamath Lake. Messages from Washington, D.C. made it clear that President Polk wanted California. At Klamath Lake in southern Oregon, Fremont's party was attacked by about 20 Indians on the night of March 6, 1846. Historians agree that these were most likely Modoc men. 3 men in camp were killed. The attackers fled after a brief struggle. Carson was angry that his friends had been killed. He took an axe and avenged the death of his friends by chopping away at a dead Indian's face. Fremont wrote, "He knocked his head to pieces." In retaliation for the attack, a few days later Fremont's party massacred a village of Klamath people along the Williamson River. The entire village was razed and at least 21 men, women and children were killed. The Klamath are a separate people from the Modoc. Bear Flag Revolt in June 1846. Fremont and Carson both participated in a California uprising against Mexico called the Bear Flag Revolt. Mexico ordered all Americans to leave California. They did not want to go, and declared California an independent republic. American settlers in California wanted to be free of the Mexican government. The Americans found courage to oppose Mexico because they had Fremont and his troops behind them. Fremont wrote an oath of allegiance. He and his men were able to give some protection to the Americans. He ordered Carson to execute an old Mexican man named Barasayu and his 2 adult nephews. These 3 were captured when they stepped ashore at San Francisco Bay. They were executed to keep them from taking reports to Mexico about the uprising. Fremont worked hard to win California for the United States. He became its military governor. Carson took military records to the Secretary of War in Washington, D.C. Fremont wrote, "This was a service of great trust and honor, and great danger also." Quote, in 1847 and 1848, Carson made 2 quick trips to Washington, D.C. with messages and reports. In 1848, he took news of the California gold strike to the nation's capital. Books and dime novels. Carson's fame spread throughout the United States with government reports, dime novels, newspaper accounts, and word of mouth. The dime novels celebrated Carson's adventures but were usually colored with exaggeration. A factual biography was attempted by DeWitt C. Peters in 1859, but has been criticized for inaccuracies and exaggerations. Carson became the hero of juvenile fiction not just in the United States, but also published in French, German, Portuguese, Gujarati, Hindi, Sinhalese, Arabic and Japanese. Dime novels. The first story about Carson's adventures was printed in 1847. It was called An Adventure of Kit Carson, A Tale of the Sacramento. It was printed in Holden's Dollar magazine. Other stories were also printed, such as Kit Carson, The Prince of the Gold Hunters and The Prairie Flower. Writers thought Carson the perfect mountain man and Indian fighter. His exciting adventures were printed in the story Kiowa Charlie, the White Mustanger, or Rocky Mountain Kit's Last Scalp Hunt. In this story, an older kid is said to have ridden into Sioux camps unattended and alone, had ridden out again, but with the scalps of the greatest warriors at his belt. Indian captive Mrs. Ann White in 1849, Carson guided soldiers on the trail of Mrs. Ann White and her baby daughter. They had been captured by Apaches. No one paid attention to Carson's advice about a rescue attempt, and Mrs. White was found dead with an arrow in her heart. She had been horribly abused, and may have been passed among her captors as a camp prostitute. Her child had been carried away, and was never found. A soldier in the rescue party wrote, "Mrs. White was a frail, delicate, and very beautiful woman, but having undergone such usage as she suffered nothing but erect remained. It was literally covered with blows and scratches. Her countenance even after death indicated a hopeless creature. Over her corpse, we swore vengeance upon her persecutors. Carson discovered a book about himself in the Apache camp. This was the first time that he found himself in print. He was the hero of adventure stories. He was sorry for the rest of his life that Mrs. White had been killed. He wrote in his memoirs, "In camp was found a book, the first of the kind I had ever seen, in which I was made a great hero, slaying Indians by the hundreds. I have often thought that Mrs. White read the same, for my appearance that she might be saved." Memoirs. In 1856, Carson told his life story to someone who wrote it down. This book is called Memoirs. The manuscript was lost when taken east to find a professional writer who would work it into a book. Washington Irving was asked but declined. The lost manuscript was found in a trunk in Paris in 1905. It was later printed. The first biography of Carson was written by DeWitt C. Peters in 1859. The book was called Kit Carson, the Nester of the Mountains, from facts narrated by himself. When the book was read to Carson, he said Peters laid it on a little too thick. Mexican-American War. Lasting from 1846 to 1848, the Mexican-American War was an armed conflict between the United States and Mexico. At war's end, Mexico was forced to sell the territories of Alta California and New Mexico to the United States under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. One of Carson's best-known adventures took place during this war. In December 1846, Carson was ordered by General Stephen W. Kearny to guide him and his troops from Socorro, New Mexico to San Diego, California. Mexican soldiers attacked Kearny and his men near the village of San Pascual, California. Kearny was outnumbered. He knew he could not win. He ordered his men to take cover on a small hill. On the night of December 8, Carson, a naval lieutenant named Beale, and an Indian scout left Kearny to bring reinforcements from San Diego, 25 miles away. Carson and the lieutenant removed their shoes because they made too much noise, and walked barefoot through the desert. Carson wrote in his memoirs, "Finally got through, but had the misfortune to lose our shoes. Had to travel over a country covered with prickly pear and rocks, barefoot." By December 10, Kearny believed reinforcements would not arrive. He planned to break through the Mexican lines the next morning, but 200 mounted American soldiers arrived in San Pascual late that night. They swept the area, driving the Mexicans away. Kearny was in San Diego on December 12.